In the early hours of February 1st, 2026, surveillance equipment at a private residence in Tucson, Arizona, began going dark. A doorbell camera disconnected at 1:47 in the morning. 17 minutes later, motion sensors triggered on the property. By 2:28 a.m., a medical monitoring device connected to an 84-year-old woman living inside missed its scheduled transmission. Nancy Guthrie, mother of NBC News anchor Savannah Guthrie, has not been seen since. More than 50 days into a federal and state investigation, no arrest has been made, no suspect has been publicly identified, and the question of what happened inside that house remains, in the words of investigators, unresolved. Nancy Guthrie had lived for years in the Catalina Foothills, a private residential community in the hills north of Tucson in Pima County, Arizona. Neighbors described her as a familiar figure, someone who walked the neighborhood regularly, kept a consistent routine, and was known to those who lived nearby. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, that routine followed its established pattern. At 5:32 in the afternoon, she traveled by Uber to a family dinner. At approximately 9:48 that night, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, dropped her off at her home. Surveillance footage captured the garage door opening and closing. That would be the last confirmed visual record of Nancy Guthrie alive at her residence. What investigators found when they arrived the following day placed this case into a different category entirely. The scene at her home indicated, according to Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, that she had not left under her own power or by her own choice. Blood discovered on the front porch was confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Nancy Guthrie. Personal belongings had been left behind. Her vehicle remained at the property. Investigators processed the scene as a crime scene. By February 2, the case had been formally reclassified as a criminal investigation. Ransom notes were reported in the days that followed. According to law enforcement, those notes were sent not to the Guthrie family and not to law enforcement. They were sent to media outlets. That deviation from standard ransom methodology was noted by investigators as a significant anomaly, and it is one element of this case that has not yet been explained. That detail would become important later in the investigation. On February 10, the FBI released surveillance footage and still images captured by the doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's residence. The footage showed a masked and gloved individual approaching the front entrance of the home. According to the FBI, the suspect appeared to be male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches in height, of average build. The individual was wearing a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker backpack and what appeared to be a holster. Investigators documented the suspect tampering directly with the doorbell camera and placing plant foliage over the lens to obscure its field of view. The footage was reviewed by law enforcement, forensic analysts, and, critically, a large number of members of the public who were following the case through news coverage and social media. One of those public observations would surface a detail that investigators, by their own account, had initially missed. At the time the footage was first reviewed by law enforcement, they were focused on the individual in the foreground, tracking physical descriptors, possible identifiers, and what the suspect was carrying. What was visible in the background, over the suspect's shoulder, had not been the primary subject of that initial review. What appears in that background, observed and documented by individuals analyzing the footage independently, is what has been characterized as a light source. The suspect in that footage appears to turn and look in the direction of that light. Whether that represents a waiting vehicle, a second individual, or another explanation entirely, has not been confirmed by law enforcement. What it raised, both in the public investigation and within the formal inquiry, was the question of how many people were involved in the removal of Nancy Guthrie from her home. Among those living closest to the residence was a neighbor, identified publicly as Jeff Leamy, whose home sits approximately 4 houses away on a connecting street. Lemmy came forward voluntarily and provided information to both the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI. The information he offered pertained to 2 specific dates: January 31st, 2026 and January 11th, 2026, the night of the confirmed disappearance and a night 3 weeks earlier. On both evenings, Lemmy stated that his dogs, typically sound sleepers who required no nighttime trips outside, woke him in the early morning hours and showed behavior he described as unusual. On January 31st, around 1 a.m., he took his dogs to the rear courtyard of his property. Reviewing his home camera footage later, at the request of investigators, he observed his dog on video looking intently toward the distance, fixed, focused, for a sustained moment, before moving on. Lemmy stated he had no recollection at the time of hearing or seeing anything that struck him as significant. What Lemmy also discovered when reviewing that footage with investigators was that 2 of his home cameras had been offline on the evenings. In question, he stated he learned of the outages only during the review process. Whether those outages were related to other activity in the neighborhood has not been confirmed by investigators. It was, however, a detail that was logged and shared with the FBI. The physical geography of the neighborhood surrounding Nancy Guthrie's home became a significant element of the investigation. Lemmy described a utility road running alongside his property, a service corridor maintained for power company access and reportedly used informally over the years by local students as a cut-through to reach a school bus stop. That road connects to a cul-de-sac that abuts the rear of several properties and, according to analysis of aerial maps, offers a potential access route to Nancy Guthrie's home that would avoid the primary street. FBI investigators walked that route with Lemmy, assessing the terrain, dense cactus, brush, and rock, to evaluate whether movement through it at night would have been practical. Separately, a vehicle was reportedly observed by Lemmy's wife parked on Escalante, the street where Nancy Guthrie lived, approximately 50 yards from the residence on a Saturday evening prior to the disappearance. The description provided was limited, and no identification of the vehicle or anyone associated with it has been made public. The information was shared with investigators. Forensic analysis of the area immediately surrounding Nancy Guthrie's home produced a second line of inquiry that has not been resolved. A series of marks, described by investigators and analysts as ruts or ridges, was observed in the gravel surface in front of the residence. The marks appeared to show 2 parallel narrow-gauge lines running in a consistent linear direction, without significant deviation, across the surface of the front yard. The width and depth of those marks and the point at which they appear in relation to the documented blood trail near the porch entrance have been subjects of forensic discussion. Experts consulted during the investigation noted that the gravel composition of the surface makes a forensic cast unlikely to produce usable evidence. Any casting medium would lift aggregate material from the ground rather than a clean impression. The primary method of preservation for those marks has been photography, analysis of what object or device produced them, and whether the marks were present when the abduction occurred or were introduced afterward by personnel on the scene remains an open question. At the time, investigators could not definitively determine whether those ruts represented evidence of the removal of Nancy Guthrie or something unrelated to the incident itself. The question of how entry into Nancy Guthrie's home was achieved has also been the subject of investigation and expert analysis. The front of the residence was equipped with a wrought iron security screen door. Locksmith and security experts who examined the hardware involved stated publicly that the standard residential lock installed on a door of that type, a conventional deadbolt and pin tumbler cylinder, is accessible through established lockpicking methods. Those include tension-based raking, single-pin manipulation, and lockpick gun techniques. Experts stated that an experienced individual could defeat such a lock within seconds. Whether a lockpicking device was used to enter Nancy Guthrie's home has not been confirmed by law enforcement. Speculation on that point has emerged from neighbor accounts, including observations about the wrought iron gate's lock mechanism, and from broader theories about how entry was achieved without visible signs of forced entry. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has not publicly addressed the entry method. The investigation has involved multiple agencies operating along parallel tracks. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, under Sheriff Chris Nanos, holds primary jurisdiction over the case and over physical evidence collected at the scene. The FBI's Phoenix Field Office has provided forensic and digital support, including the recovery of additional imagery from cameras positioned at the back, side, and pool areas of the property. None of those cameras, investigators confirmed, captured relevant footage from the night of the disappearance. A documented procedural tension emerged between the two agencies over the handling of forensic evidence. The FBI requested that DNA samples and a recovered glove, found approximately 1 to 2 miles from the residence, be sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. Sheriff Nanos declined that request. A private forensic laboratory in Florida was contracted instead, at a reported cost of approximately $200,000. Nanos stated publicly that the decision was made to consolidate all evidence at a single location, where existing DNA profiles were already stored, avoiding the transfer of materials to multiple facilities. The FBI, according to reporting, expressed concern that the approach could introduce delays. DNA analysis of the recovered glove produced a match to a local restaurant worker. Investigators determined that individual had no identifiable connection to the case, and no corresponding record was found in federal law enforcement databases. That lead did not advance. Analysis of mixed and partial DNA profiles recovered from inside the residence continues, with genetic genealogy techniques under consideration. Sheriff Nanos confirmed in March 2026 that workable DNA from the scene exists and is actively being processed. January 11, 2026, 3 weeks before the confirmed disappearance, emerged as a date of particular investigative interest. Neighbors reported being asked about that specific date during canvassing. The Guthrie family referenced it in a public statement. Sheriff Nanos explained that the date originated from Google, the company that owns the Nest doorbell camera system, which assisted investigators in retrieving imagery from Nancy Guthrie's device. Google initially communicated to investigators that certain surveillance imagery, showing an individual who did not appear to be wearing a backpack, may have been captured on January 11th. Google subsequently retracted that characterization, stating they could not definitively attribute the imagery to that date, or any specific date. The images lacked embedded date and time metadata. Sheriff Nanos stated that while the suspect may have visited the property in advance of February 1st, he could not confirm that with any specificity. The question of whether the individual documented in the doorbell footage conducted prior reconnaissance of the residence, and if so when, has not been resolved. As of March 24, 2026, 52 days have elapsed since Nancy Guthrie was last seen. No arrests have been made. No individual has been publicly named as a suspect or formal person of interest in her disappearance. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has confirmed that all members of the Guthrie family, including her children and their spouses, have been cleared. The FBI has offered a reward of $100,000. The Guthrie family has separately offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Neighborhood canvassing remains active. The FBI has been asking questions about a vacant property near the residence and about construction workers operating in the area in the weeks prior to the disappearance. No connection between those inquiries and the incident has been publicly established. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage from the surrounding neighborhood remain under review. More than 20,000 tips have been received since the investigation began. Sheriff Nanos has stated publicly that the investigation is not close to being classified as a cold case. What occurred inside that house in the early hours of February 1st, 2026, who was responsible and where Nancy Guthrie is now, remains unknown. The investigation is ongoing.